2020 has fundamentally changed the context in which South African municipalities govern and provide services. Future Cities Africa has partnered with South African Cities Network on a series of 4 episodes that look at how cities have fared during the pandemic and what fundamental lessons have been learned. We cover economic recovery, climate change, governance and municipal finance, and built environment. Danga Mughogho is Program Manager for Well-Governed Cities at South African Cities Network. Danga, welcome. Give us a brief introduction on your role at South African Cities Network.
Thank you for having me, Dan. I am the Program Manager for Well-Governed Cities at the South African Cities Network, which means that I have a portfolio that covers urban governance and municipal finance. And starting with urban governance then, the governance program at SACN, we understand governance as consisting of both governing through systems and processes, but also managing competing public interests and private sector interests through political processes. Well-governed cities, as far as we understand them, are efficient. They manage their finances prudently, they're sustainable, and are accountable to their citizens. Citizens in well-governed cities, therefore, actively participate in government processes and in democratic local government elections and decisions about local government. And we also see that governance in well-governed cities is therefore participatory and inclusive and indeed democratic. And we consider the efficacy of governance, therefore, by the quality, how good quality local services are, how good local institutions are. And also we look at the democratic participation of local citizens in policy making and also communities in that process, and the accountability, finally, of elected officials and representatives. And then moving on to the finance side of things, our sustainable municipal finance program, the South African Cities Network tracks and analyzes performance in the 8 metros and Msunduzi. And every 2 years, we produce a State of City Finances report targeted at senior municipal administrators and politicians, as well as officials in other spheres of government in national and provincial, with an interest in public finances and the intergovernmental fiscal framework. And the State of City Finances publication is a flagship SACN report. And accompanying this report is a People's Guide to the State of City Finances, which distills the messages in the main report and is targeted to a broader citizen and civil society and non-financial audience.
Let's reflect on the State of City Finances report of 2020. What is the state of municipal finances?
In 2018, the last State of City Finances report called for cities to be at the center of development and for systemic problems to be addressed. But we find in the 2020 report that little has changed. So cities remain the drivers of the economy and home to most people in South Africa, but continue to face challenges of inadequate finance for infrastructure and service delivery and the affordability of municipal services for customers. Cities are finding it increasingly difficult to raise revenue to cover their mandates, mainly as a result of structural issues within the local government fiscal framework and the deteriorating macroeconomic environment in which they operate, which are both matters over which cities have little control. Of course, cities could always improve their fiscal effort and expenditure deficiencies, but the fiscal space open to them, we find in this report, has shrunk. So not only has the population of low-income groups continued to grow as urbanization brings people to cities in search of jobs, which remain elusive due to slow and decreasing economic rates of growth. So this is the pool, if you will, within which cities operate. But also from a city perspective, reduced margins on electricity and water sales as a result both of rising unemployment and stagnating household incomes, and above inflation increases in the cost of bulk purchases. And by bulk purchases, we mean the electricity and the water that cities purchase from Eskom and the water boards and then sell on to residential and non-residential customers within their boundaries, mean that cities are less able to cross-subsidize the provision of basic services for lower income residents, which is a key element of the report that I'll get into a bit later. And so faced with a declining and a shrinking fiscal space, cities have used the local government equitable share, which is the division of revenue allocated to the local sphere by the National Fiscal Authority, to cover some of their expenditure obligations, a decision which is at odds with the original purpose of the local government equitable share as envisaged in the 1998 local government white paper. And this report indeed is a first attempt to look at the expenditure by cities of the local government equitable share, and is a contribution to understanding this very important unconditional grant that the local sphere receives from the National Division of Revenue. So just to summarize, the report examines city financial performance over time, including the effects of COVID-19 on city finances. It looks also at the affordability of municipal bills, and then finally provides analysis of the expenditure of the local government equitable share. So having said that, I think, and given a brief overview of the context within which cities operate, as well as the specifics around how then this report addresses city financial performance over time and analyzes it, I'll now go into a bit more detail and can provide a bit more information about the specific elements of city financial performance. So number one, the changing state of municipal finances from a general overview perspective. Number two, looking at the affordability of household bills from the perspective of city residents. And then number three, looking at the local government equitable share. So starting with the changing state of municipal finances, we look at a number of dimensions. We look at city revenue, we look at city operating expenditure, and combine these two, if you understand revenue as money coming in and expenditure as money going out, into a sort of a metric that we call the city operating surplus or deficit, which is in layman's terms, whether the city is in the red or in the black. We then also look at city capital expenditure, consumer debtors, who are the people who are residents of the city who perhaps still owe money on their municipal bills, and then relate that to a discussion about city cash management. Cities have grown their revenues by an average of 5.7% per year, which is quite good considering the macroeconomic environment, which is quite strained, as I mentioned earlier. And this increase in city revenue has been above operating expenditure growth of 5.5%. And so combining these two elements, we get a operating surplus, which once again is a comparison between city revenues and city expenditures. And we find that the average annual increase in operating surpluses was 4.2%. which is a positive development. So across the board, cities are actually doing positively. A key trend over the period was an increase in in the share rather of property rates as a proportion of own revenue. And this is important because cities gain revenue by selling water to customers, selling electricity to customers, but also by charging owners of property within their boundaries a certain amount based on the percentage of the value of their property. And this is a very important source of revenue for cities because it's entirely discretionary and entirely within their control and not dependent on consumption of electricity and water as the others are. And the reason for this is because the revenue from service charges, which is the selling on of electricity and water to customers, has been growing at a far slower rate than that of property rates. So in other words, property rates revenue has increased as a share of the revenues that cities are able to raise on their own. I mentioned the local government equitable share earlier. There's another source of city revenue which comes in the form of transfers from the national government. And these transfers are conditional, unlike the local government equitable share, which is an unconditional transfer. And by conditional transfers, we mean that they're attached to certain things that conditions that the National Treasury says that the money must be spent on. So whether it's for transport, for informal settlement, upgrading, or any other purpose. In fact, there's a large number of these conditional grants. And what we find is that over the reporting period, which is between 2015-16 and 2018-19, transfers to cities grew by an average of 4.7% per year, which is dramatically lower than the 12% recorded for the period covered by the State of City Finances 2018. And this is for a number of reasons. Over the past couple of years, the national fiscus has been increasingly strained, as we've seen in reports by the Ministry of Finance. But also at the same time, I think National Treasury has been tightening up on the conditional transfers because there has been a pattern across the cities of all the money being allocated in a particular budget year, not all that money that's been transferred from the national government being spent. So I think there's been a tightening up of the amount of money being dispersed from the national government. However, the knock-on consequence of this is that cities use that money typically for capital investments. So many of those conditional grants have been used for capital investments. And we see that the slower growth in conditional transfers over the reporting period was partly responsible for the lower capital expenditure that we see in cities. So between 2015-16 and 2018-19, capital expenditure within cities grew at only 1.5% on average. And Cities can, of course, make use of their own revenues in order to finance infrastructure investment and so on. But we do find that they did not make significantly more use of their own sources of finance, although borrowing did, in fact, contribute slightly more to total capital financing. And in fact, Cape Town, Ekurhuleni, and Johannesburg issued new bonds during this period. Moving now on to how cities manage cash and debtors and their cash management. We find that between 2015-16 and 2018-19, combined cash collection rates for the cities actually declined from 91% to 87%, which is not great. The National Treasury benchmark is around 94%, and cities have typically, in the past, come closer to that percentage. We suspect that this is a function of the fact that the residents from whom cities would have been collecting bills were facing straitened economic circumstances over the past few years. So their municipal bills became something that they found a challenge to pay. And this cash bucket, if you will, that cities collect is combined into what we call a cash coverage ratio, which is the amount of cash that the city has on hand. And we find that as a result of this decline in cash collection rates from 91% to 87%, cash coverage ratios, which is the amount of cash cities have in hand, also declined then from 2.14 months to 2.07 months, which is not necessarily concerning as yet, because the National Treasury recommendation is between 1 month and greater. So not necessarily something of great concern at this point.
On the topic of the pandemic, how has the pandemic affected city finances?
The impact of the pandemic on city finances has really been threefold. And we are now sitting a year after the lockdowns began in South Africa. And we can notice already three key points. The first is that cities are getting reduced revenue from property rates and also service charges. So in particular from non-domestic customers, reduced economic activity as a result of lockdowns has meant that businesses have been shut down, in some cases operating on a limited schedule, which means, of course, that a business then consumes less water and electricity on its premises. And seeing that cities get a certain percentage of that water charged to the business, therefore their revenues have gone down. Also, we find that depressed property markets have affected property rates revenue. So that has been also a consequence of lockdown in general, and to the extent that cities have had to change their property rates regimes based on the property markets, that has had an impact on their revenue. Also has the closure of some businesses in effect has removed the revenues from businesses altogether. So that's number one, so decreased revenue. Number two is higher city expenditure. So as you can imagine, cities are responsible for sanitation of public transportation facilities. They have also had to provide emergency water supplies. They've had to buy protective equipment for their employees, but also they've had to deal with having employees also on lockdown. So employees who are working remotely and the costs associated with that, providing them with computer equipment, providing them with data and so on. And so that has increased city bills. They've also had to provide food and shelter for homeless residents of our cities. Finally, as I mentioned earlier, the economic environment has been worsened. And so customers and city residents have actually lost their jobs. In many cases, entrepreneurs have been running businesses and experienced reduced business. And so the ability of residents to actually pay their municipal bills has declined. So this is the third area really in which city revenues have been affected. So non-payment of municipal services for household incomes have impacted on the ability of residents to pay their municipal bills. And so all these three things have had a knock-on effect. So decreased revenue from services, decreased revenue from property rates, increased expenditures around the basic costs of dealing with the pandemic, as well as decreased payment of bills. And we expect that these effects will be temporary, but depending, of course, on whether businesses reopen again, the extent of the economic recovery post-COVID, we cannot say for certain how long these effects will last. And I think that summarizes really the very big impact on municipal finances. And I expect that we'll see this even more so when we see audited figures in the next State of City Finances report that comes out in the next couple of years.
What are the trends in the affordability of municipal bills?
Municipal bills, clearly, as city residents, is something that we all, those of us who are fortunate enough to be in a position to pay bills, are concerned about, and something that we have consistently reported on in the State of City Finances, precisely for that reason, to provide a citizen perspective, if you will, on municipal bills. And what we do in the report is we we do a series of calculations to establish 4 different categories of municipal bills, from the lowest income who are due to pay municipal bills to the highest income group, 4 different categories, and correlate those with standard costs of providing electricity, water, sanitation, and also waste facilities to those packages. And based on that, then are able to speak to the affordability of municipal bills for a resident within each one of those 4 categories. And we find that across the board, the price of municipal service packages has increased in real terms, which is clearly of concern to residents. And additionally, we find that the price increases have been highest for the lower income packages and lowest for the higher income packages. So to explain that a bit further, for the 4 different price categories I mentioned, service packages type A, which is the lowest income, have increased by 2.1%. For type B, they increased by 2%. Type C, which is 1.2% increase, and type D was a 1.1% increase. So once again, type A is for the lowest income customers, and type D would be the highest earning customers. And so this suggests straight away that, in fact, the people with the lowest incomes are finding that their bills are increasing to a greater extent than people with higher incomes, which clearly is not something that is ideal. If you think about the tax system, we have an income tax system where people who earn more pay percentage-wise a greater proportion of their income towards the state. And we'd want to see the same in terms of municipal bills. So to use a fancy term, we prefer that the bills are considered to be progressive. So in other words, the more you earn, the more you pay. And in the case of city billing, this is not necessarily the case, which in a country with the inequalities that we have is clearly an issue of some concern. Having said that, however, the affordability for all packages has improved. And so this sounds like a contradictory finding, but actually what we're finding is that affordability has improved slightly for lower income packages and remains stable or become progressively more affordable for higher income packages, which is in keeping with the description and the explanation of the package and pricing dynamics that I mentioned before. What we are finding, however, is that services are not affordable for the poorest. And the way we're able to determine this is that we use a 10% benchmark of income as an indicator of an affordable bill. So any bill that is greater than 10% of the income of a resident, we'd say is unaffordable to them. And we find that type A customers, who once again are the lowest income customers, pay more than 10% of their income towards municipal bills in all the cities, except for Ekurhuleni. Whereas customers in all the 3 other categories, so types B, C, and D, spend less than 10% of their income on municipal bills. Now, this is obviously quite a complicated picture that cities need to deal with, and actually setting city tariffs and budgeting associated with it is a difficult balancing act for cities. And this is something that perhaps residents are not necessarily always aware of, but it's something that we get into in some detail in the report. And cities, in fact, are facing a dilemma. Their populations and households are growing rapidly. As we mentioned, urbanization is constantly on the increase. And urbanization typically is a phenomenon that is for lower income groups. At the same time, the economic environment in which cities operate is slow, unemployment is rising, and housing incomes are also being affected by these macroeconomic trends. And it's only the wealthiest, in fact, whose incomes are increasing over this period of time. And so ultimately, cities can only provide services within their financial ability. At the end of the day, they face costs for providing those, and then they also have to recover revenue in providing those services. So this is the difficult equation that cities do in fact have to balance. And we consider this question in the report and suggest that in this regard, cities may consider a number of options, and they may need to consider some interventions. So number 1 would be scaling back services to make them more affordable. Perhaps the other would be to increase the focus on core services. And this is something we discuss in terms of the broader fiscal framework, which suggests that there may be some unfunded mandates which cities are taking on and they're not necessarily receiving compensation for. We also suggest that they may avoid these unfunded or expanding mandates, and then also that they may make better use then of revenue sources other than property rates and tariffs, and think about perhaps additional revenue sources to supplement their revenue streams. And we indeed end this section of the report with a discussion that suggests that perhaps it's time for cities to consider an additional revenue instrument, additional local tax instrument, in order for them to meet the costs of their mandates.
Can you take us deeper into the report findings on the local government equitable share?
The local government equitable share, as I mentioned, is in fact an unconditional grant that comes from the National Treasury to cities. And it is intended in local government legislation to provide for basic services for low-income indigent residents who are unable to pay for the municipal bills that I mentioned earlier, which apply only then to residents who meet a certain threshold of income. And the data reported by the cities shows that as a group, they're delivering free services to fewer households than envisioned in the allocation formula. And by the allocation formula, this is a formula that the National Treasury uses to determine and to estimate how many indigent households they expect cities to have to pay for based on data from Stats SA, census data, and so on that they triangulate, and which allows them to say, X city will have so many indigent residents who will therefore require such and such a quantum of electricity, such and such a quantum of water, and so on that the city will provide, which then they use to calculate the amount that they expect the city would be spending. But what we're finding, as I said, to repeat, is that cities are actually spending less than the National Treasury expecting, which is entirely within their rights, because as I mentioned earlier, this is an unconditional grant, and cities can spend the local government equitable share on items other than free basic services. However, the data indicates, though, that the intention of the grant itself, at least in its spirit in the letter, is not necessarily being met and fully realized. And the reason for this is tied to some systemic structural issues within the local government fiscal framework that I think have superseded, if you will, the initial calculations and the initial thinking and the reasoning behind the local government equitable share. So cities are functioning in an environment of increasing input costs and a sluggish economy, as we mentioned earlier. And this has constrained growth in revenue and leads to an increase in the number of low-income households within city boundaries. And also cities are finding, therefore, that the number of households needing support is increasing. They're finding it increasingly difficult to raise the revenues to meet those obligations. And as a result, they are not able to cross-subsidize from the bills that they charge to customers to as great an extent that they would like. And also they rely, therefore, on the local government equitable share to meet other requirements and commitments that they have to subsidize some of these other obligations, and are not therefore able to use it just for free basic services as the legislation intended. And as their fiscal space closes, in fact, we're finding that cities are forced to target subsidies, the local government equitable share, free basic services, and by targeting to identify the households that they deem to be in need of those services much more tightly than was perhaps the case in the future. And so therefore you're seeing fewer households than the National Treasury expected receiving support from cities through the local government equitable share. And this we think, and the report says, that this is an unsustainable situation, and in fact contributes to an increasing body of knowledge that we have generated through the State of City Finances reports over the years, which suggests that there's a number of gaps between what cities are expected to take care of, so what is within their mandate, and the revenues that they are able to raise to address those needs and those obligations. So we're finding those four gaps are as follows. We find an unfunded mandate gap. So municipalities are incurring expenditure on services and functions that are not in their mandates and for which they do not receive revenues. So one of those examples, I think, is libraries. Running city libraries is something that is not necessarily within their mandates, in addition to others that I've hinted at. An expenditure inefficiency gap. And by this we mean municipal expenditures which are higher than the reasonable costs that one would expect associated with that. But having said that, this is probably within the bigger scheme of the four gaps, the least of concern, as municipalities are in fact fairly efficient in their expenditures. Then a transfer gap. And this is a gap that is the transfers that are coming from National Treasury in the form of the conditional grants, which we argue is part of the contribution to the structural funding gap that cities face. And then finally, a fiscal effort gap. And much like the expenditure efficiency gap, the margin for this is very small. So for cities to increase their efficiencies in collecting cash, in exerting fiscal effort to collect all the revenue that is owed to them. And so in summarizing, we can say that the inefficiency and fiscal effort gap are within the control of cities, at least partly anyway. And some have considerable space to improve in those areas. Some cities do better at this than others. But having said that, The biggest gaps are, in fact, the unfunded mandate gaps and the transfer gaps. And we suggest that from a systemic point of view, perhaps, that there's a need to look at the local government fiscal framework and take into account these gaps and how we might solve them.
How do municipalities bounce back when it comes to their financial state? What needs to fall in place?
Great. How do cities bounce back? My goodness, that's a $1 million question. It's a difficult one to answer because the things that are within cities' control are fairly limited. So they have control over their own revenue, which is the property rates revenue, and also the revenue from bulk purchases. As I mentioned earlier, the revenue that they receive from bulk purchases, which is of electricity and water, is dependent on consumption. So although it's within their control in terms of the amount that they charge residential and non-residential customers for those bills, the economic situation within which those customers and businesses are operating affects the amount that they buy. So that's not entirely within cities' control. So that's number one. The next question is the transfers that they receive from their national fiscus. Within this broader economic environment, of course, income tax revenue, corporate taxes, and so on to the national fiscus have declined. So it's very unlikely, and we have seen in budget speeches over the last couple of years, that there'll be an increasing tightening of belts and public expenditure will be decreased. So it's very unlikely that that will change. And in fact, those transfers may in fact decrease. Finally, you add to this picture the fact that the pandemic is continuing to affect the country, and the impact of that on residents in terms of lockdowns, in terms of business closures and so on, is likely to be something that will continue for the immediate future, and something which cities do not have control over as well. So all those factors, all those moving parts are things which affect cities, and to varying degrees, they have control over them and not. Within the report, we do look at the projections that cities are making over the medium-term expenditure framework, and to varying degrees, they look forward 3 and 5 years into the future and wonder and project make projections rather about the revenue streams, about their expenditures into the future. And to varying degrees, some cities expect things to get better sooner rather than later, whereas others expect that things will remain to be difficult for them for some time yet. So I think the circumstances, of course, of each city are different, but I think it's fair to say that the sorts of things that cities would need to do to address the situation that they find themselves in are really things that that in the main are out of their control.
What are the main lessons of the report and implications for municipal finance in the future?
Well, the main lessons of the report really, I'd want to pay attention to the big picture questions that we've been raising both in this state of city finances around the local government equitable share, and some questions about the local government fiscal framework, as well as the municipal financial model itself, which has been raised in previous editions of the State of City Finances. So the State of City Finances 2018 makes the argument that the vision espoused in South Africa's urban policy, the Integrated Urban Development Framework, in fact, for productive, sustainable, inclusive cities can only be achieved within a municipal financial model that is fit for purpose. And some of the critiques that we've made over the years have applied to how cities gain revenue. So we have made critiques of the fact that cities are highly dependent on property rates revenue in terms of their own revenue. And this has implications for a key urban policy goal, which is densification. Property rates revenue is something that increases with new properties that are built within city boundaries. And so cities have a disincentive, if you will, to densify. So new developments are allowed on the periphery and are encouraged because they increase revenue for the city. But that, however, is at odds with our urban policy, which I said is very much predicated on spatial transformation and densification. The main argument, therefore, that we make is that cities must address the systemic financing problems that they face in meeting their development midterm mandate. Municipal budgets, number one, should be aligned to policy, and urban planning should reflect that orientation. The critique of property rates revenue as a source and the impact that therefore has on spatial transformation is something that I've just hinted at. We also suggest, and as I mentioned earlier in this interview, the funding gap that cities face. We looked at 4 elements of that funding gap, and we need to say this to find a way for cities to bridge the capital funding gap, which impacts on their ability to provide infrastructure for the residents who are coming into the city, so providing bulk infrastructure in terms of water and electricity and informal settlements and so on, to deal with the challenge of urbanization, but also to maintain infrastructure that already exists. Infrastructure typically has a lifespan of 30 years, and without adequate maintenance, it falls apart and is not then able to even serve the existing needs of city residents and businesses. So we make a case for fiscal transformation. We argue, in fact, that there's a misalignment between policy, budgets, and planning. And we also say that there's contradictions between the municipal revenue model and local government's urban policy goals and objectives, and in particular desired developmental outcomes, of which the most important is spatial transformation. We also then look at how sustainable the financial model is from the point of view of residents. So when we have a model that's dependent on selling electricity onto consumers, and the electricity, at least in South Africa, in the main is generated from coal-fired plants, which is an unsustainable, environmentally unsustainable form of energy, and you have a model that's dependent on selling that on, then clearly that poses existential questions about the model itself. And we see this around the fact that independent power producers are now able to produce electricity at a lower rate than Eskom is, for example. But then that has implications for cities that are dependent on selling on electricity to residents as they shift, goes to cleaner forms of energy. What impact will that have on the municipal finance model? And in bigger picture terms around that issue is, as we transition to a climate resilient economy, what impact will that have on city finances in general? And the pandemic has really shone a spotlight on some of these challenges that cities are actually facing. In terms of the shock that it has been to the system, we discussed the revenue impacts, the expenditure impacts of the pandemic, but it's forced us to sort of look, and I think this is something that we saw across the board, to look at systemic issues that in fact the pandemic has shown cracks in. And just as many societies have been forced to think about how they're organized, perhaps we argue that the pandemic offers an opportunity for cities, for those responsible for the local government fiscal framework, to look at some perhaps of the systemic issues within the funding model that affect cities. And one thing perhaps in closing I could say is that we have made these arguments over many years into the policy space. And what we'd like to see now is that some of these arguments to be taken up. So for example, arguments around alternative tax at local government level that cities could perhaps use as an alternative source of revenue, to consider different ways of subsidizing public transport, to think about perhaps alternatives to the dependence of cities on property rates revenue as a source of revenue, are all things that should be considered within the policy space. And our hope is that moving forward, these are things that we'll be able to engage with stakeholders in greater detail and with greater urgency on.